Good evening, everyone. And before I continue, I just want to ask if everyone can hear me clearly. Stephen?
Yep.
Is great. Good evening and welcome everyone to the India-Canada Friendship Circle. Honorable guest speakers, Ms. Marla Khanna, Assistant Deputy Minister for Sub-Saharan Africa, Global Affairs Canada, Mr. Richard Sharpe, Director of Equity, Anti-Racism, Diversity and Inclusion at Justice Canada, and my fellow esteemed ICFC board members, Mrs. Malti Kesarwani, Dr. Stephen Desjardins, Mrs. Geeta Thakur, Mrs. Nipa Banerjee, Mr. Prakash Diar, Dr. Veena Rawat, Ms. Anne Pollock, Special Advisor, Dr. Elliot Tepper, and dear friends. It is with great pleasure I welcome you all to our second lecture of this year under the theme of diversity and inclusion. It's great. We seem to have a really good turnout tonight, and despite a beautiful evening outside, I thank you for sharing your time with us this evening and joining us. I would like to inform everyone that this event is being recorded. My name is Roohi Ahmed, and I'm the president of the India-Canada Friendship Circle, also known as ICFC. The microphones are currently shut off, except for those speaking. You may wish to keep your camera on or off, and during the question and answer period, we kindly ask that people please identify themselves. To our returning members and friends in Ottawa, we really missed seeing you in person last year. We unfortunately suspended our face-to-face activities due to the COVID crisis and for the health and safety of our members. When the pandemic continued, we realized this year that we will have to join the Zoom culture. And so here we are. 3 weeks ago, we held our very first virtual event with two fascinating guest speakers, the High Commissioner of India to Canada, Mr. Ajay Bisaria, as well as Mr. Robin Hyam, former Canadian ambassador and author. As a kickoff to our diversity and inclusion lecture series, both speakers examined the governance of diverse communities and what comprises the Canadian identity. We were also joined by Member of Parliament Chandra Arya to talk to us about how we could help with the COVID relief efforts in India. That recorded session will be up on our website. Today, we have two senior federal public servants who will share their perspectives on diversity and inclusion through the lens of a multicultural Canada and through the lens of public service. The ICFC is a registered nonprofit, non-religious, non-political organization that was founded in 2004 in Ottawa, Canada. The ICFC is also about bringing people together as well as sharing diverse ideas for peaceful dialogue on different topics to learn something new about Canada and India. We've hosted some 100 prominent experts to date from a variety of fields and have followed a tradition of socializing after each lecture. We hope to enjoy our Indian snacks and tea with you all again someday soon. For today, we would like to try and maintain that informal and interactive atmosphere that we had in our face-to-face events. And therefore, I would like to kindly request our Vice President, Dr. Stephen Desjardins, who is managing the technical side of this event, to open up everyone's microphones just for a few brief minutes. I understand we have friends who have joined us from Boston, Bangalore, and Kingston, Ontario. If anyone else is from out of town or new to ICFC or a former speaker, we would love to hear from you. So please take this opportunity just to say a quick hello to us and share your name, profession, or area of study and your city. And I would like to open up the floor now and let's invite everyone. We won't invite everyone because we don't have time, but those who are at least from out of town or new to ICFC, we would really like to welcome you, and please welcome and introduce yourselves. Don't be shy.
I'm not either, but I want to welcome our former President Malti to the Zoom generation.
Wonderful. Malti Kesarwani from Toronto, and the founder of ICFC. So welcome to the Zoom generation, Malti. We're so happy to have you join us tonight. Is there anything you'd like to add? I think you'd have to unmute yourself. Okay, is there anyone else who'd like to jump in?
Yes.
Yes?
Yes.
Yes, who is that? Go ahead.
Hi, if no one else is jumping in, I will. I'm Colin Saldana. I'm the chair of the Royal Commonwealth Society of Toronto, and it's the first time I'm joining these events organized by your group, and I look forward to an interesting conversation, and hopefully that the Indian community will continue to participate more in Commonwealth initiatives that are taking place. It's an important member of the Commonwealth, and we hope to see more joining the conversations. We had a very successful tribute a couple of weeks ago in honor of the Duke of Edinburgh on his passing away. So I'm looking forward to the event today. Colin Saldana of the Royal Commonwealth Society. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us. We have had a number of your members join us in previous events, so you're an important member of ICFC. And yes, I did hear about the event you held in honor of the passing of Prince Philip. And thank you for sharing that. Is anyone else brave enough to say hello? We're a friendly bunch, so it's a friendship circle.
Hi there, my name is Janet Hope and I'm from Ottawa. And this is my second session that I've been able to join, and I'm very much enjoying learning lots of, and meeting lots of new people. So I look forward to being able to do it in person.
Thank you, Janet. Great to see you again. And is anyone else willing to?
My name is Krishna Gupta. I'm a member of the Royal Commonwealth.
Sorry, we can't hear you, Mr. Gupta. If you can just unmute yourself.
I have unmuted actually.
Okay.
Okay. I am a member of the Royal Commonwealth Society and the past deputy chair of the Royal Commonwealth Society Canada. Right now, I'm in Savannah, Georgia. I'm really enjoying the topics chosen by you. They're excellent topics and very good speakers.
Thank you so much. We appreciate your support. And
this is
anyone
Lloyd
else?
Stanford. How are you?
Hi,
Good
Mr.
evening.
Stanford. Yes, we're fine, thank you. How are you? Thank you for coming. I see David Kilgore has joined us again. Great to see you.
Roohi, very quickly, Roohi, listen, thank you for doing this. Well, one of you or both of your speakers speak to the issue of University of Toronto, maybe. When I went to law school there were about 100 of us in the class. I won't even tell you when it was so long ago. 3 out of the 100 were women.
Ah.
3. And now, of course, I'm sure more than 50% in every law school in class in Canada. Maybe one of them or both of them will speak about that.
Well, 50% of the panel is a female lawyer today, Khanna, so that's pretty interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Roohi.
Thank you, David. And I'm sure many of you recognize Mr. Kilgore, our former Secretary of State for Asia Pacific at Global Affairs Canada, and many hats to fill.
Good evening, Roohi.
Yes?
Good evening, Roohi.
Yes, good evening. Who is speaking?
This is Lloyd Stanford calling.
Hi.
Good.
What is that to put here?
Thank you for joining us. Hey, is there anyone from Bangalore online? I think Stephen, you'd mentioned we had people signed up from Bangalore, or anyone from Boston. Okay, maybe they'll join us later. There is a big time difference with India. So let's turn to our program. And today, well, we talked about the ICFC, so I think everyone has a good idea of what our mandate is. And for an overview of today's program, we'll have our two guest speakers present for about 20 minutes each. Then we'll have a Q&A with the audience for about 40 minutes and a summary then given by Dr. Nipa Banerjee. We hope to conclude about 8:45 p.m. and we'll keep the lines open for a bit for anyone who just wants to stay behind and socialize. Today's guest speakers, with roots in Africa and South Asia, are a reflection of the changing demographics that we see in Canada's major cities. As this month of May is a celebration of South Asian Heritage Month, it is germane to point out that South Asians make up the largest group of visible minorities in Toronto at about 13% of the total population, according to the 2016 Canadian Census. Besides Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal, and Calgary round out the top 4 Canadian cities attracting newcomers. India is amongst the top 3 source countries of immigrants in Toronto and Calgary, where our first guest speaker experienced the influence of growing up in a multicultural Canada. Our second guest speaker views diversity through the lens of the African diaspora. A year ago yesterday, events in the US spilled over into Canada and support for the Black Lives Matter movement soared last summer. Recently, we have also seen a call to action from the top down, beginning with the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, for policies to fight systemic racism and discrimination in the public sector. We will hear more about these experiences from our guest speakers today. So without any further ado, I would like to introduce Mr. Prakash Diar, who is the moderator of today's panel, and he will introduce the guest speakers. We are privileged to have Mr. Prakash Diar as a member of the ICFC board. Mr. Prakash Diar practiced law in the area of human rights in South Africa and Canada, and is internationally known for his defense of the Sharpe Bill 6 in apartheid South Africa. He testified at the United Nations, which passed 2 resolutions condemning the apartheid government for the impending execution of 6 innocent people. He also launched an international campaign which got then Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, President Reagan, and Chancellor Kohl to personally intervene in an attempt to save the Sharpe Bill 6 in the mid-1980s. In Canada, Mr. Diar received a fellowship at the University of Ottawa in the Human Rights Research and Education Center. He has authored a book on the Sharpe Bill 6 and has been a legal counsel for the Canadian Human Rights Commission and won one of the biggest race discrimination cases in Canada, a case driven by Dr. Shiv Chopra. Mr. Diar has also been working with the Minister and Deputy Minister of Justice on Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's mandate to renew the Crown's relationship with Indigenous peoples, which includes adopting the United Nations Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and implementing the call to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report. So without any further ado, I would like to invite Mr. Diar to take the floor.
Thank you, Roohi. Thank you for the kind introduction. I wasn't expecting that at all. So as Roohi said, my name is Prakash Diar, and some of you may recall that I was an invited speaker in 2018. And then Auntie Multi and Dr. Stephen Desjardins and his wife, Selena, basically coerced me into joining the board of the ICFC. I'm just kidding. It's been a pleasure being a part of this organization. I'm really excited about our speakers tonight and the topic of discussion, of course, diversity and inclusion. As Roohi has pointed out, I was born in South Africa. That's where I was raised. We had a lot of diversity, but no inclusion, unfortunately. 90% of the population of people of color were discriminated in the law, in the constitution, and excluded from almost anything in South Africa. Interestingly enough, indigenous people in Canada in particular have also been excluded by being denied their inherent rights. Let me say right up front that Canada is no South Africa, but we did export to South Africa the Indian Act and the reserve system under which apartheid was eventually formally established. I literally owe my life to Canada. So when my life was threatened, because as a human rights lawyer, as Roohi had pointed out, I was a target. Canadians, the very kind Canadians, sprung into action and gave me and my very young family a safe passage to Canada exactly 32 years ago. So Canada is one of the best countries to live in, perhaps for the exception of January and February months. I come from a warm climate, so January and February are not my favorite months. But when it comes to diversity and inclusion, Canada has a long way to go. When I came, my very first case I was involved in Canada was in 1990. And some of you may have heard about this case of Dr. Chanda Grover against the NRC. And we won the case before the Human Rights Tribunal. Did many other cases, Dr. Shiv Chopra in particular, and NCARD, the National Capital Alliance on Race Relations against Health Canada, in which to date it is one of the only decisions way back in 1997 that we showed that Health Canada was discriminating against visible minorities from moving into senior management positions. I was the lead counsel in that case. So yesterday was an important first anniversary, of the murder of Mr. George Floyd. Much has happened in the last year, from the Prime Minister down, to the Clerk of the Privy Council, want to address the issue of systemic racial discrimination, especially with Indigenous people and our Black communities. They are the most disadvantaged from all of the groups. And a lot of action has been already started, I'm glad to say, and I'm sure Richard and Mala will perhaps touch on that. My Minister of Justice in January this year received a supplementary mandate from Prime Minister Trudeau that he needs to address the issue of systemic discrimination, especially as it relates to Blacks and Indigenous people. So I'm really excited about the discussion that's about to take place. So let's get started in hearing from our two very distinguished guest speakers. Our first speaker is Mala Khanna, who is the Assistant Deputy Minister for the Sub-Saharan African branch at Global Affairs Canada. Mala was previously the Assistant Secretary to the Cabinet for Legislation and House Planning at the Privy Council Office. Prior to that, Mala actually worked at the Department of Justice as the Deputy Assistant Deputy Minister for Public Law and Legislative Services. Mala also occupied various other positions in the Department of Justice, including as Deputy Director of the Crimes Against Humanity and War Crimes Section, and as Counsel at the Human Rights Law Section. Mala graduated from McGill University with a Bachelor of Laws and a Master's in Social Work degree. She also has a degree in History from the University of Alberta. So Mala, we look forward to your talk and a discussion with you subsequent to that. It's all yours, Mala.
Thank you very much, Prakash and Roohi, for that very, very kind introduction. It's just a real pleasure to be here today with you. I'm so pleased to be able to share my personal story. And although I will talk about my work at Global Affairs, I do feel the need to say that I am not here in an official capacity. So this really is my personal story. And so I hope that you will find it to be an interesting one, and one that we can share lots of common elements with. One of the first lessons that my parents told me when I was growing up in the 1970s is that it is good to be different. And I think that that's really the theme of my talk today. And to do this, I think I need to spend some time talking to you about my background. And I think I also need to tell you in full disclosure that my parents are here with us today. They are joining us from Calgary via Zoom. Thank you, Zoom. So I did just want to make sure everybody was fully aware of that fact. So they are here listening in judgment. So my father, Surinder Kumar Khanna, is Punjabi and was raised as a Hindu. He was born in Rawalpindi in 1936, but he moved to Mombasa, Kenya, when he was a baby. My dad's family initially came to Kenya as laborers with the British military, and later as a part of the labor force that built the railway line from Mombasa to Kampala. My grandfather on my dad's side worked on the railroad, and my grandmother was a teacher. They later opened a corner shop in Mombasa. My dad speaks Punjabi, Swahili, Hindi, Kutchi, Gujarati, Urdu, and English. He will tell you that he speaks Italian, but he doesn't. My mother's pre-marriage name is Mumtaz Begum Ismail. She's Gujarati, and she was raised as a Bora Muslim. She was born in Nairobi. Her family moved from Gujarat to East Africa in the 1800s as merchants. Her side of the family initially settled in Madagascar and Zanzibar, and later moved to Comoro, Tanzania, and Kenya. My grandfather on my mom's side was a family doctor. My mom speaks Gujarati, Swahili, Hindi, English, and French. My parents met in law school in England in 1957, and after both had graduated from law school, they eloped, a true love marriage. They then returned to Kenya, where they had my brother Chand in 1966. Chand speaks English and Swahili. 6 years later, in 1972, they moved to Toronto, and 1 year later, I was born. My mother used to tell me that although my parents and my brother became Canadian citizens as quickly as they could, I was the only real Canadian in the family because I was born in Toronto and I speak English and French. We lived in Toronto until 1980, when we moved to Calgary for 2 years, before returning back to Toronto for 2 years, and then back to Calgary for 5 years, and then I moved away to university. I went to university in Edmonton and Montreal. I've lived in Ottawa since 2000, the longest I've ever lived in one place. I met my husband here. He's from Saskatchewan, and his ancestry is German, English, and Swedish. We have 2 daughters who were both born here in Ottawa, and I've been a public servant for my entire career. So I chose to spend that much time on my background because I really think it illustrates the complexity of the question, that simple question so many of us are often asked: where are you from? I share my personal background with you as well because I think it has really shaped my desire to belong and my feeling of social exclusion. Growing up in Toronto and in Calgary in the 1970s and the 1980s, it was easy. I was brown, or brown cow, as many of my schoolmates referred to me. Except at that time, being brown was really not a thing. It was black or white. Black, like the Cosby Show or the Jeffersons, or white, like Family Ties. Nothing in between. As a result, I alternatively wished that I was white, and I wished that I was Black, though more often I wished that I was white. And it's here where my parents' encouragement that it is good to be different came in. I didn't understand how it was supposed to be good to be different when all I wanted was to have macaroni and cheese and a thermos in my lunch instead of kebabs. In other words, I didn't understand how it could be good to be different when it was because of my difference that I was not accepted. Around the same time, my older brother talked to me about apartheid in South Africa. I still remember my 12-year-old self filling with sadness and outrage and disbelief that such a system could exist and could be lawful. I realized that that was 1984, the same year Prakash was defending the Sharpe 6. Of course, my own experiences with racism paled in comparison, but they did inform my sadness and my outrage. And yet, if I am honest, while learning about apartheid opened up my eyes to injustice and shaped my desire to want to make a difference in the world, I would still continue to define success as acceptance amongst my white peers, which often meant downplaying my difference. I know now that this is called internalized racism, and it runs deep. As a child, I didn't talk about it. The day-to-day racial bullying that I faced on the playground, the racism that my older brother faced when he played hockey, or that my parents faced as new immigrants in the workplace, that was not something we discussed in the dinner table. Actually, in preparing for this talk, my brother was reflecting too on how even as adults, we haven't really shared these stories. My parents modeled to keep the chin up and work hard. After all, this worked for them. And while they have never dwelled on details, I am certain that they have endured their share of racism and exclusion in Kenya, in Britain, and in Canada. And as much as there is a lot of pain still associated with these memories, I have come to appreciate my parents' wisdom. That I should be proud of my identities, my communities, and my difference. That difference is a value. And that not completely fitting into one group or another can be a strength. I realize now that it is as a result of these experiences that I actively seek out and listen to people's diverse views, backgrounds, and approaches, while at the same time trying to seek out the common bonds and making connections and community in spite of these differences. I think these differences, or these experiences rather, have helped me to be more empathetic and more comfortable with gray and ambiguity. I think I have also come to realize that as a result of my experiences, I have the ability to hold multiple seemingly contradictory viewpoints in my head at the same time. And I think there's increasing research to really support that idea. Looking back, I think that my interest in law and social work as a means of addressing root causes of inequality and injustice was born from these experiences. I think that pursuing an interdisciplinary program in law and social work and pursuing a research focus on intersectionality, which is the study of how different systems of oppression, such as racism and sexism, can work together to create qualitatively different lived experiences that must be actively studied and understood in order to really understand the impact of discrimination on individuals with diverse backgrounds and identities. All of that comes from that same place, that same desire to understand difference. When I started as a lawyer in the public service in 2000, race was not overtly discussed in the workplace, even where I was in the human rights law section. I was one of very few people of color. I didn't rock the boat, and I learned how to succeed in the system. This is not what diversity and inclusion means. This is not valuing difference in the way that my parents suggested. I think in effect, it's a form of internalized racism, because I believed that I needed to look and act like my colleagues. I also became very comfortable being the only person of color in a room. In the last few years, that has started to change. I think it's been brought on by the outcry surrounding the murder of George Floyd and the calls for change from younger employees of color who are not willing to stay silent. I have also realized that while remaining silent may have worked for me, I was benefiting from that system. And this has caused me to think more about the privileged position that South Asians held in South Africa, and even my own family's history in East Africa. And so as the Assistant Deputy Minister for Sub-Saharan Africa, this is a very uncomfortable feeling. And as a result, I really want to make room, in particular for Black and Indigenous voices around the table. And as Prakash noted, and as I'm sure you'll hear from Richard next, in the public service right now, as it relates to diversity and inclusion, the focus of attention really is on anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism and the need to take steps to address the barriers that these groups face, including underrepresentation, especially at senior levels. To be honest, I still find it difficult and uncomfortable having these conversations in the workplace, but I'm inspired to keep doing so in large part because of the younger employees of color who demonstrate courage and wisdom in their desire to create a workplace that is truly diverse, equitable, and inclusive. So let me shift gears a little bit now and talk about diversity and inclusion as it relates to my work as a parent of two biracial teenagers. So my husband's German, Swedish, and English roots, I think, further complexify their identities and their answer to the question, where are you from? But we talk about race and racism around the dinner table. I think this comes more naturally to them, given that they're not the only ones anymore. There are so many more shades of brown around us. And I think there seems to be a greater understanding of the fluid and the context-driven nature of identity. I want my daughters to be able to self-identify on their own terms. But I also want them to understand that because of their darker skin, they will encounter racism. But I do think it is less internalized. At least I hope so. I also want them to understand and be proud of their complex, rich, and varied family history. 2 years ago, we had the opportunity to visit Kenya, Tanzania, and Zanzibar with my parents, and hopefully we'll be able to go to India and England and Sweden and Germany. It's also interesting, I think, that where apartheid was my source of rage and sadness and my awakening to institutionalized injustice, for my daughters, it has been the Black Lives Movement and Canada's history of colonialism and the legacy of residential schools. These were topics that we didn't spend any time on when I was at school. I think this is progress. So, how does this relate to multicultural Canada? First of all, I have to say, sorry, Mum, I don't think that my mum was right when she said that I was the only real Canadian because I was born here. I think there is ample evidence of the fact that that is just not the case. And I think that Canada has done a good job of making people feel Canadian, even if they weren't born here. I feel that if Canada is to be successful in its approach to pluralism and to multiculturalism, and here is where I think my parents were right, the key is for us all to think about how to make room for different identities, different histories, different perspectives, especially those for groups and individuals who are most marginalized. And I think that's how you create inclusion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mala. Thank you for being so brave to share your story with us, and especially that your parents are present. It's very brave of you. I just have to disagree with you one small little bit. I don't think your mom was wrong. I think she was just saying in jest that you are the only true Canadian. I don't think she was serious about that. But yeah, you trace the history of your parents going back to Africa as laborers, and that's a very similar history that I come from, where our ancestors were taken as what they used to call indentured laborers. But in my respectful view, I think it was more akin to being slaves, to their white masters. We've often heard the diversity is a strength from our Prime Minister. He said that so many times, and I think you echo that. And your small family is a great example of that. So thank you for sharing that with us. I also like to say, I think you touched on it, empathy and how we need to be empathetic. And in my personal experience, at least for me and my family and how we were brought to Canada, Canadians were very kind-hearted and very empathetic. And one of the things I do in my present job is I have co-developed and I deliver training sessions to justice employees on the principles that affect the relationship between Canada and Indigenous peoples. And one component of that is the Indian residential schools experience. One of the saddest chapters of Canadian history, no doubt. Equally sad, I think, is the fact that many Canadians who went through the school systems, and it's changing now, but in the past, that part of the history was never taught at school. Most Canadians are completely ignorant of that horrific experiment that went so badly. But I'm heartened that I've done about 41 sessions to about 2,000 employees thus far. Every session that I've done, I have not had a single person not tear up when they hear the true story from survivors of what the Indian residential schools meant. So it gives me hope for Canada and for Canadians. And I think the more they get to know and learn about the experience of the diversity and inclusion and the lack of that and how it has affected people of color, I think the timing could not really be better for us in the last year especially. And building on this momentum, I think significant changes can be made and will be made. So thank you again for sharing, Mala. And I'll leave for questions and comments a little later after I introduce Richard's talk, and then we can do that. So let me just introduce Richard. Richard is a friend. I know Richard. He has worked within the Federal Public Service for 25 years. I personally don't believe that. When you look at Richard, he only looks about 25 years old. So I don't see how he can actually be in the public service for 25 years. His work has involved, of course, leading initiatives in support of Government of Canada's commitment to the United Nations International Decade for People of African Descent. Richard is also one of the founders of the Federal Black Employees Caucus that has been working with federal public service and union leadership to address anti-Black racism in the federal public service. Richard has also held local, regional, and national union positions with the Public Service Alliance of Canada, the Canadian Association of Professional Employees, and the Manitoba Federation of Labor. He has worked locally, regionally, nationally, and he serves to improve the conditions of Black and Black African diaspora communities in Canada. Over the last few years, Richard has been a speaker on addressing systemic racism, anti-Black racism, and how to be an ally within the Black Lives Matter movement. Richard is presently the Director of Equity, Anti-Racism, Diversity and Inclusion, and leads the recently established Anti-Racism and Anti-Discrimination Secretariat at the Department of Justice. So Richard will very briefly provide an overview of the efforts made to address this anti-Black racism in Canada, within the context, of course, of the United Nations International Decade for People of African Descent. He will also discuss the major components of an action plan to address the systemic racism within the federal public service and in Canadian society. So the floor is yours, Richard.
Thank you, Prakash, for that very warm introduction. I always feel like I should be introducing you, given your history and work within Canada and internationally. It's a pleasure, absolute pleasure to be here.
Richard, you're breaking up a
I'm
little
going to
bit.
try to be
Richard,
brief,
can you hear me?
which is
Richard?
really difficult for me because I like to talk. But I did want to say first that.
Richard,
okay.
you're
Yes, I
breaking
can.
up
I
a
can
little
hear
bit.
you. Yes.
You're breaking up a little bit.
Yes. Yeah, I'm going to move.
Okay.
To get a better connection. And hopefully I will not lose you. Hold on just a moment.
It sounds better already.
Okay. I'm going to have to move because for some reason I'm on my phone. I've been having a lot of connection problems.
Yeah.
But
we hear you well right now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to do this the old-fashioned way on my phone. Okay. So yeah, so I always feel like I should be introducing you, given your experience and the contributions that you've made to Canada. Just to give you just a quick overview of who I am. My parents are Jamaican born. They grew up in England. My father went to Oxford, came to Canada in late 1960s. My mom followed him and married him in London, Ontario. They chose London, Ontario, Canada, because they came from London and he needed to find a place on the map that reminded him of his new home. I was born a year later. My father got a master's degree in education and spent the better part of the rest of his life trying to get work, because in Canada, regardless of the education you had as a Black man, it was incredibly difficult for him to find work. I saw a lot of Southern Ontario as we moved around for him to try to find places to work. We went to Ottawa for a while. We went back to London. We ended up in Manitoba. He ended up working on a reserve for a while. We ended up moving to Morris, Manitoba, Dominion City, Manitoba, Winnipeg, where I eventually said I had enough and I stayed. And I stayed in Winnipeg. He actually took the rest of the family. There were 6 of us children, took them all to California, and I stayed. I actually, and this is where this is where the story aligns somewhat to this community, is that I fell madly in love with a young woman of Indian ancestry who was born in Guyana, South America. And I also got accepted to go to the University of Manitoba for my training and my learnings. So when I got that opportunity and realizing that this is the person I wanted to be with for the rest of my life, I decided to stay there. My experience in Canada has been similar to what Mala has said in terms of her presentation, and that there was a lot of exclusion. There was a lot of trying to assimilate to what the white-dominated norm really is here in this country. which is really impossible for someone like me because I'm not white. I'm not blonde, I'm not blue-eyed. I have light-colored skin. And that made my life very challenging when I was growing up. Interestingly, when I met the woman of my dreams, I ended up catching more hell from members of her community who felt that she should not be with a Black man. I found out and was very surprised to understand that not only is there a sort of a caste system in the country of India, but that caste system is exported to other parts of the world with the Indian community. And we were quite dismayed at the response that we received from that community. We actually eloped and similar to the previous speaker, and took off to Japan for a couple of years to get away from family and better understand myself, actually. I used those years to actually study on Black history of people of African descent in North America, in Europe, on the African continent, in South America, and came back to Canada with a better understanding of who I was, and with my bride. So the story becomes a bit more complex for us because suddenly we start having these wonderful children. She thought she could not have children, and then 16 years later, we started having them, and now I have 3 beautiful children who are also biracial. But biracial, Indo-Canadian, now that she's Indo-Canadian, and African-Canadian, if you will. So it's very interesting. It has been very interesting with the life project of raising these beautiful children, because initially I think that there was a feeling that they weren't Black. They understood very early, especially when they initially went to school, that white is right and Black is wrong. And there was a desire for them when they were younger not to be Black. So we were fine with that. You can be whoever you want. If you're Indian, you can be Indian, that's fine. Or if you want to be a mix, we were completely open. We didn't put that kind of pressure on our children. But it was when they started to get to a particular age where society was telling them that they could no longer be Indian, that my son suddenly was a dangerous Black young man. My daughter was a beautiful Black woman. And even though my youngest daughter, who has the longest hair you've ever seen, goes down to her butt, she now identifies as a Black woman. But it's very interesting because we mix cultures. I feel like I've been to dozens of pujas. I greet my father-in-law with Sitaram all the time. And you know, it's a beautiful thing when the cultures mix, and they mix with, you know, openness and love and caring. So it has been our work really to bridge the gap that perhaps was imported from a time and a culture where people of dark skin were untouchable, and where the lightest of the light were considered superior or the best. Unfortunately, some of that plays out in Canada and has played out in our workforces. If Canada practices something akin to white supremacy, then groups that come here and try to assimilate, try to make sure that they fit in. And so you don't want to be the group that's on the bottom. You want to be closer to the group that's on the top if you want jobs, places to live, and so on. So that's been part of my work as well. I worked for many years, as Prakash had said, in Winnipeg, working with racialized communities of all backgrounds, Indians, Chinese, people of African descent, with the intent of working against racism in all of its forms. It was very rewarding. But I ended up coming to Ottawa. And coming to Ottawa afforded me an opportunity to work at some of the highest levels within government. Again, not just always on issues of anti-racism, also performance measurement, reporting, risk management, and so on. But I saw very clearly the caste system that exists within Canada, within the public service. And definitely that has affected my career as well. People say that I'm a pretty smart guy and I do a lot of things, but people don't seem to think for the longest time that I should be an executive or a leader within the federal government. And so I had to actually leave government and change the world and then come back to the public service with even more skills and more accomplishments, where people could no longer say that, Richard, you were not ready. I engage with the Prime Minister's office, the Prime Minister, deputy ministers, and ministers to push agendas to support Canadians, and in particular Black Canadians. So I have a very good understanding how to play the game. And so there are many, many people like me, but they don't get the chances that I've received. I think I'm very fortunate. But I guess, you know, regardless of the work that I've done, I really did think that I was going to retire, not as an executive, but as a very senior analyst, still providing executive supports. But I think the thing that I think has changed the world were the events of last year. It was the murder of George Floyd under the knee of this agent of the state, if you will. And that moment that we all saw, or many of us saw, I've actually never seen the whole video all the way through. I can't watch it. But what that video did was show to people, everybody, how anti-Black racism works in this country and in North America and also in other parts of the world, where a person can be dehumanized to the point where even if they're begging for their lives, they are still killed by an agent of the state. And that we see that not just in terms of policing, but we see that in education, we see that in healthcare, we see that in employment, we see that in business. We see it in many different ways that most Canadians don't see it because they are not targeted. But when you're targeted, you know. So that moment hit everybody quite hard. I think it hit white people and other racialized people very, very hard, because they realized what we've been saying for the last 2 generations, since the killing of Dr. Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and other leaders in the late 60s, that this has been real. This is our reality in North America. And so perhaps I would have been content to just continue doing what I was doing, as traumatic as it was for the Black community to be living the events of last year. But my kids really were profoundly impacted. I wrote an article that I have just actually released to a few people. I'm not sure what I'm going to do with it, but I shared it with the most senior executives within the federal public service, the clerk of the Privy Council, deputy clerk, heads of unions. I wrote this article that actually I had been writing for more than a year. I released it yesterday on the 1-year anniversary of the murder of George Floyd. And the parts that I write about that are probably the most important are the impacts that George Floyd's killing had on my children, and their feeling of not belonging, and their feeling of being afraid as biracial children, because that Black part of them, they feel and they know that they are at risk of harm psychologically and physically. And that for me, that was completely unacceptable. So I have to say that I thought I was going to go into retirement last year. And I know that, you know, Prakash is saying that I look like a young guy, but I'm an old man in many respects. I've been through a lot. But the reality of the situation is that I, myself and many others, felt compelled to do this work even more, with more intensity, because the very lives of our children are at stake. I will be comfortable. I'll get a good pension. The worst that I will experience in my life is that I will be pulled over one day by an Ottawa police officer asking me if it's my car and where I'm going and the like. The driving while Black thing is that kind of weighs on me and weighs on my children, weighs on my son whenever we leave our home. In some ways, COVID was a blessing because we did not have to interact with everybody, the rest of the world, the institutions, in order to get to work. The most dangerous thing for us is getting out of our house. And many Canadians don't really realize that, but it's very true. So what that means for me and what it means for the work, because the work that I have done as Prakash has stated is quite varied, is that the change that we are looking to make for our society cannot be predicated, it cannot be focused on what we have always done. The diversity and inclusion illusion has pretty much kept us in a place where we talk about supporting other people and supporting difference, but not doing anything to make sure that that difference is respected and supported. So what I've been talking about is equity. What I've been talking about is human rights. And so with even the initiatives that I'm pushing at the Department of Justice, or with the senior leadership in the federal government, or within the unions or the community, it's about focusing on equity and making sure that whatever we're doing within our society, be it healthcare, be it access to justice, be it access to economic opportunities, that we use an equity lens, that we look at the people who have been the most marginalized in this country. From the creation of our country, the first prime minister of this country, more than 100 and almost 200 years ago, basically said that we need to keep Canada white and we need to keep the Asians out. And the laws and the Department of Justice was created 186 years ago to ensure that Canada stayed white with various laws and legislation, and also to make sure that the Indigenous people of this land could not use the land and needed to stay on the Canadian version of the Bantustans, where they would not be able to benefit, and that has created generations of lost people. So from my perspective, there's a couple of things that I do share openly and often, and that I'll run through them very quickly to sort of end my my brief talk. Is that in order for us to affect real change that creates real inclusion, racial inclusion, justice, and full participation of different groups, in particular Black and Indigenous people, we need to be able to make sure that we focus on those people because they have been the most marginalized. We need to make, wherever we can, ally and become co-collaborators on the work that we do. We have to work with the Indo-Canadian community. We have to work with the Chinese community. We have to work with white people. We have to work with institutions. We have to work with unions. We have to work with businesses to affect that change. We need people to basically make a decision at an individual and organizational level that they are going to listen to the lived experiences of the most marginalized people in this country, that they're going to listen without fear, without dread, without questioning what they are hearing. We need folks who are allies and supporters to ask how they can help. And when we say, this is how you can help, to hear what we say without fear and judgment and doubt. And we need people to be able to help create safe space for people, both within our workplaces and within our society. We need to reevaluate our processes and our systems of policing, of education, of healthcare, of business. We need to be able to look at what the characteristics of good leadership looks like. We need to be able to measure and quantify what it is that we do when we say that we're helping those people. What does it look like? How can we evaluate that? Are there ways in which we can improve how we engage? Are we getting the input of the very people who are being the most marginalized in the society? Because at the end of the day, those are just a few things. There are many more. I developed a framework for the Department of Justice in which they can use to make themselves more representative and to deal with the systemic racism, both anti-Indigenous racism, anti-Black racism, systemic discrimination of people with disabilities, discrimination against LGBTQ2+ people. So I have a framework that's put in place that requires leadership and resources to make real. And I think we're in a position now where 1 year after George Floyd is that things have not slowed down. People are still asking for that change. And they're looking for the kinds of leadership and results that would make my children, my biracial children, able to live in this society without the fear and actually with peace of mind. I have never had peace of mind in this country. And I want my children to be able to have that. Even though I live in a nice house and I drive a nice car, I know what happens when I leave my home and what the risks are for me to get from A to B. So that's just one element that we as Black people have to deal with. My biracial children now have to deal with that, which is something that I was hoping within the lifetime that I've had in work, that we would have addressed all of these things by now. So what I'm hopeful for is that these kinds of gatherings and these kinds of conversations can help build more understanding and more support and solidarity around the kind of work that we need to do to address the systemic anti-Black, anti-Indigenous, and other forms of discrimination within our society. We're no longer capable of being able to stay in our own communities and hope for the best. We're all intertwined and we're now intermixing in a way that we have never seen before. So Canada is changing. Canada, there's more people like me, and my children are way more militant than I ever was. So I think that in terms of what the future holds, I think the future is bright. I think all of this has forced a kind of change that I did not expect I'd be able to see in my lifetime in terms of government and leadership making room for us at leadership tables and providing resources and support for fundamental change in various aspects of our society. And I would basically call on the folks on this line of all racial backgrounds, you guys are, the colors of the rainbow, to embrace the kinds of work that we're doing in our communities and even within government, and to support what we're doing, because we cannot do it alone. We cannot do it in isolation. And some of the things that I'd mentioned before in terms of what we can do to support this work are individual, but they're also organizational. And I've been able to translate that into action and actionable things. And I think that together we can basically do almost anything. So I'll end there on a quite positive note. I feel very optimistic about what's happening in this country right now and the world actually. And I'm happy to have had the opportunity to speak to all of you today, and would be happy to engage in the conversation or discussions that follows my brief presentation. So thank you very much again, Prakash and your team for inviting me.
No, thank you, Richard, for a wonderful presentation and also sharing your personal story. I guess when we were putting together this program, we did not realize that you and Mala would have so much in common in terms of your family and your family makeup. So that's quite something. It wasn't planned, I can tell you that. I like the way you ended on a very positive note. We need to be allies. We need to be collaborators. I'm going to tell you, I'm going to be your co-conspirator, okay? And I'm sure there are many within this group who will be willing to be your co-conspirator, not just an ally. So we need to change the world, and it's one step at a time. But the timing could not really be better, given what you just talked about 1 year from yesterday, what happened to George Floyd. The momentum is there. But most importantly, I believe, that's my personal belief, that there is this political will to change. There is this, from the Prime Minister down, I think there is this, that things need to change. They cannot continue a status quo. So it's very encouraging from that point of view. We all want to live in a better life. Canada is a great country, but it can be so much greater. a great country for everyone, just not a select few. So thanks for taking the time and sharing with us your personal experience, but also the positive impact that you are making within the federal public service as well as outside the federal public service. One person definitely can make a difference, but you're right. When we put our heads together, we can move mountains. So, so you can count on us, I think, for support in that light. I think we're all pushing in the same direction. So thanks again for taking the time, Richard. I actually met Richard a few years ago. Richard and I were on the same panel. Richard does talking at high schools, and so do I, on these types of things of anti-racism, trying to teach the kids, there's a better world out there. And so we hooked up, I think, Richard, this was at least maybe more than a couple of years ago. And who knew that you would land up at Justice just the last fall. So we're really happy to have you there, and happy that the leadership saw it necessary to bring somebody like you to effect real change, because a number of studies have been done over the years, lots of talks, but I think people want to see action now. So, and you're pushing in the right direction. So thank you. So thank you to both Mala and Richard. I have not moderated before, Roohi. So is this the time for us now to encourage questions and comments of our two esteemed guest speakers?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Prakash. And perhaps you can continue to moderate the Q&A session. I would like to maybe call on Stephen to give us a few guidelines on the technical use of Zoom for the Q&A session. Stephen Desjardins?
Okay, so what we would like to do is we'd like to ask people to either ask questions in the chat, or if they are comfortable being on screen, please raise your hand using the hand raising function down at the bottom. And let's open the floor. I mean, we do have a couple of comments in the chat if people have not seen them. Basically speaking very positively about Richard and his thoughts, and speaking from his heart. So that is very nice to see. Okay, so we have our first hand for Mr. Gupta.
Yeah, good afternoon. My name is Krishan Gupta. I left India in 1964, and I have studied in Germany and worked in Brazil. From Brazil, I came to Canada. So what I've learned during my 57 years of stay outside India, we don't try to adopt the ways of the country where we go, and that's why we get into trouble with the people. So one thing which I've learned in my life, try to change myself according to the situation where I am. Then we will be better adopted. And Canada, as said by both of the speakers, is the best country in the world. That's my comments.
Thank you, Mr. Gupta. Thank you for sharing your thoughts and your experience with us. Really appreciate that.
Okay.
Nan Tandon.
Yes.
Go ahead, Mr. Tandon.
First of all, I'd like to thank both Richard and Mala for sharing their wonderful. I have a question both for Richard and another for Mala. A couple of years ago, some of us, one of Ahmed here and another Praveen Yogi today, we did a study of the Canadians in Ottawa. And they trying to figure out the number of Indo-Canadians in our national capital. And we looked at Stats Canada data based on ethnicity. And we ran into doing that, we ran into some problems. And, we have somebody like you, Mala, how would you have identified yourself? Because you had options. You could identify your ethnicity as African, Indian, or simply Canadian. So you have identified yourself. My question for Richard is, Richard, you have been in California as well as in Canada. So could you give us a sort of a set of your impressions about what they call diversity and what we call multiculturalism in California or here, because California is also a very diverse and multicultural society. And in your impression of both with the government as well as in private, how is it similar to there in Canada? And are we really that different as we claim to be? That would be my question for Richard.
Richard, you're on mute.
I was just wondering if
Richard, you're on mute. Richard is on. Richard, I think you're on mute.
Yes, I'm off. But the young woman was saying something.
Okay, so Roohi.
Yeah, no, very quickly. I was wondering if Mala was able to hear the first question because the mic was going in and out. But basically, there was a study done by a couple of professors in our group here of Indo-Canadians. And when they're looking at Stats Canada data based on ethnicity, I think the question they came across, which posed some difficulty, was, you know, how would one define themselves in the case of Mala? How would you have defined yourself in that type of a study, given your multiracial background?
Yeah. To elaborate, she had options. She could identify in the Stats Canada ethnicity survey. They had options. If her ethnicity as African, she could identify herself as Pakistani because her grandfather from Rawalpindi. She could identify herself as Indian because she's from Gujarat and that kind of area. And she could simply say, I'm Canadian. I don't have any other, I don't want to identify as any other ethnicity. Being a second generation Canadian, we were wondering how somebody like her would have identified herself.
So thank you for the question. I think it's a fascinating question, and I think, I mean, I can say that generally when I get those kinds of Statistics Canada questionnaires, I will identify as South Asian, and I think that's because that's my name. It's how I look, my ethnicity, and so I think, most of all, I identify as ethnically South Asian, but you're right that, and I think that's what I was trying to say in my talk, is that identity and where you're from is very context driven, and I think I like now the idea that I have choices and I can be from more. I don't have to be from one place, and I don't have to. I can honor all of my identities. And to be honest, and my husband jokes with me about this, I will give my answer depending on how I feel, and more importantly, what I think the intention of the person who's asking me the question is. And if I get the sense that they don't believe that I'm Canadian, I will stick, you know, my feet in the ground, and I will say I am Canadian, and I will not budge from that. So I like now the idea that I have the ability to choose. But in terms of statistics, I say I'm South Asian.
Thank you, Mala. Richard, the question for you was about, I think, diversity and multiculturalism, right?
Yes, I think there was the question was about diversity and multiculturalism with respects and the differences between Canada and the United States. So I think that's a brilliant question, because many people often say that Canada is not like the United States. Canada is very different. We don't have racism in Canada. We don't have anti-Black racism here. But that, of course, is not true. When my family lived in California, it was only for about 5 years. They were socialized as Black. In the United States, there's more of a melting pot. Their culture in the United States forces nationalism around being American. So everybody that comes there must sort of become American, and you put your identity to the side to some extent. Even if you are from someplace else, they really do focus on the Americanness of you and how much you can become American. Canada is different in that we allow, or we say we support the diversity of peoples, and that there's not the same kind of nationalism. We have no nationalism. People sometimes say that we don't have a Canadian identity because we allow for the so-called multiculturalism to exist. But still, so people can keep their language and their culture, their religions here. There's less persecution to some extent. I wouldn't say that it was perfect here in Canada. But the reality is that much like the United States has a nationalist kind of sentiment, Canada has a sort of a Canadian identity that it pushes on people. It's sort of the French white, English white dynamic, and everything else really is other. And so a lot of the work that we end up doing in our, even within government, is to try to talk about the fact that we can all be part of the Canadian mosaic with our own identities. And that still allows us to be Canadian. I can wear my African shirt to work and still be Canadian and still be loyal to the country. And so my identity or my racial background or my culture does not mean that I cannot be Canadian or that I cannot contribute or that I'm not as good as people from Europe or who were white people that were born here. So it's different, but in some ways it's very much the same, that the hierarchy or the caste systems in both countries have white people on the top and the darker skinned people on the bottom, and indigenous people on the bottom, of course. But I hope that answers your question.
Yeah. Okay, there is a question for Richard in the chat. So do you really feel that even with your successes, the community affected has been encouraged to speak up and express themselves freely? And that's from Ken Talbar.
The community affected, if you're talking about the Black community in Canada, I would say no. I would say that the Black community in Canada is in many ways still afraid to speak up. There are many more people, especially young people, who are, sorry guys, the young people are trying to eat here. I'm shooing them away. But people still feel that fear. There's a fear that many people have, and other racialized groups have as well, of speaking out within systems and what might happen to our children when they go to school, if they'll get good education, if we can get our jobs, if we'll be safe at work, will we get a promotion if we speak out? We're seeing that is changing somewhat, but the fear is still real. There are 13,600 Black people who work in the Canadian Federal Public Service. They would say over 50% of those have said that they experience racism within the public service. There's currently a class action lawsuit against the federal government that's being led by Black employees. And about 600 employees have signed up for that Black class action. So if you really think about it, if people have been experiencing racism at such large numbers, we should have 6,000 people as part of this class action, but we don't, because there are people that are very much afraid to even still speak up when these things are happening to them. So the challenge is being, again, for me, is to create safe space so people can speak up, people can contribute to conversations about what their workplaces are like, and that we change some of our policies and procedures around dealing with harassment, discrimination, so that they actually have teeth and we can actually resolve problems in our workplaces. So I think that, yeah, we've seen some positivity. We've seen some amazing Like I never thought that I'd be in a 10,000 person protest with a whole bunch of white people screaming Black Lives Matter. I never thought I would see that in my lifetime. And I saw that last year with my kids beside me. It was amazing. So I think that there's an opportunity for change, but people are still very much afraid, unfortunately.
Yes, well said, well said. Also, you know, in the employment environment, I learned this more acutely from my own personal experience, but more from my professional experience when I was at the Human Rights Commission as legal counsel. Many people come from other parts of the world trying to make a new life for themselves in Canada. And the last thing they want to do is to jeopardize their work and face retaliation, perhaps, not so overtly. You know, in South Africa, as Mala pointed out, you know, we were discriminated in the law. And in Canada, it's done very subtly, very sophisticated, and even retaliation, you know. So many people are, I would say, still afraid, as Richard points out, to openly speak up, especially in the employment context. But I think the last year has emboldened a lot of us. And Richard would know that I was one of the co-founders recently at Justice Canada of a group called Black Employees Network, working outside of the Department of Justice, where we really need to support our other Black employees because we are so much stronger in numbers than one person who can be victimized. So I thought I'd just add that, Richard. I see there is another question for you as well.
There's
I see a raised hand as well.
There's a pile up with people in the chat and people who had raised hands. So the first thing is Mr. Barber had a raised hand a moment ago that seems to have disappeared.
If I'm still on, I would love to make a comment. This is Graham Barber speaking. Is that, am I permitted, please?
Yes.
Absolutely.
Thank you. I'm a pretty ordinary person, and I think many of the people here are, but some of our speakers I thought were a bit above normal, and I was very pleased to listen to them. My background, I've often considered myself unfortunate that I'm white. And that was partly because of my upbringing, which I don't want to go into very much, but I've lived in Africa, in Zaire for 3 years. I've lived in India for a period of time. And my best friends here in Ottawa have actually been South Asian. And I guess one of the only question I really have to the speakers is that I think as all scientists know, there's no such thing as race biologically. And I'm a physician, and we are, as soon as you take that skin off, we look alike. Whether or not we act alike, that can be very variable, but we certainly look alike. And I've seen enough people on the inside to know that, because I actually was a surgeon. And I just sometimes feel that the term racial causes more problems, because I mean, the Jews have been segregated against to the nth degree, and they still are, and they continue to be, very wrongly so. And of course the blacks are, and the Asians, everybody except the whites, unfortunately, I guess. And I just wonder whether if we got rid of the term racial and just started talking about human beings, and we're all part of humanity, and we're just very different, and some of us look different, and we're criticizing people and demonizing them just because they look different on the outside. And Martin Luther King was the biggest one that said, you know, under the skin, we're all the same. And I just think if we got rid of the fact that we look different, and some of us don't look all that different than others. So that's my comment that I'd like to make, and see what anybody of the experts think about that, because I can feel for all of them. I tell you, I'm supportive of all the efforts that are being made. Thank you very much for that chance to say something.
Thank you, Graham.
I really wish.
Okay. Yeah.
Maybe Mala wants to say something. I've been talking a lot. I hear my voice.
Well, I mean, okay, sure, I'll come in on that one just because I think, so first of all, I completely agree with you. I think race is a social construct. And I think that it's important that we all recognize and acknowledge that. I think that the trouble is when I know I sort of react when I hear people say, I don't see color. And I think the reason is because what that generally means is I'm not seeing you for who you are. And I think you know, we're the same if you act like me. And so I think what we need to be able to do is accept that race is a construct, but also accept our differences. So inside we're all the same, but we are all different, and there has to be room for that difference. And I think that's how I would answer that question.
Thank you, Mana.
Okay, so next up is a question that was in the comments. It's a question.
Just very quickly, just to pick up, I totally agree with Mala. She's so right on point. And to address the issue, right? I think to address the issue of racism, we need to understand, and we don't have a lot of time today to go into it, but we need to understand where it comes from, why we have racism, why we even have constructs of race. The construct of race is a pseudo scientific term. That and as the comment was made, as a scientist, we consider ourselves to be educated, scientifically informed people. So when we have a society that is built up of something that, and science says that we have these different races, that is actually not true. We end up perpetuating the ideas of difference, and so we need to understand why that is and who benefits the most from the socialization or the concept of race. And so if we look at who benefits the most and who benefits the least, then we can kind of understand why we have racism and why we have the concept of race. And then we can start to pick away at that. Again, not to and I agree with Mala, not to do away with race, because I like my dark skin. I like the fact that I can dreadlock my hair. I like the fact that, you know, the people from my parents' part of the country have music and culture that's different from here. And I think that makes Canada better. But what I don't think is good is that people use the concept of race to make divisions and to make determination of who is superior and who is not, which was the reason why the whole concept of race was created in the first place in the 1800s.
Thank you, Richard.
Okay, so continuing on with the order that these were received in, there's a question in the chat for Richard. There's a lot to criticize about the United States, but do you think we in the mainstream culture in Canada can learn from the United States about being more open to talking about race? Do we have a kind of polite racism here in Canada?
Absolutely. That's a great question. Absolutely. Canada has this sort of polite racism that's worse than the racism in the States. I like going down in the United States and they say, I don't like you because you're black. It's like, then you understand. I can deal with that. It's like, you don't like me because I'm black? Okay, I won't talk to you, or, you know, whatever. But in Canada, it's very different. I'll go into a boardroom and they'll say, well, Richard, that's an interesting question. Charlie over there has a different point of view, but we've never heard your perspective before, and maybe it's not the right thing to be saying here, but we welcome your thoughts and so on, but just, you know, maybe we won't go with that right now. And then so people get confused. It's like, am I being treated differently than Charlie, right? So that's worse because that plays with people's minds. I was born in this country, so I've seen everything and I know when it's happening, so I can pick it up pretty quick. But definitely, I've heard a lot of my American friends who came to Canada and felt racism here, and they felt it was so bad here. They felt it was worse than in the States. They would go back to the States. So I think that it is a problem here that we don't have conversations about race. We do need to have conversations. It's one of the biggest things that I actually push in terms of my work, is that we need to talk about race. We need to talk about white supremacy. We need to talk about how we deconstruct or take apart what we think is normal in our society. And so people don't want to talk about that because I think for, particularly for white people, and this is important to say, that most white people feel very threatened when you start talking about race. And it makes it seem like, oh, well, you're calling me a racist. I don't call white people racists. I said, we need to talk about the behavior and the things that we do as a society that harm people who are Black and Indigenous, and particularly other racialized people, Indians, Chinese people. What's happening with Asian, the anti-Asian racism right now, which is a reaction to COVID, which is a reaction to them not being fully Canadian, even when they are. Like, we need to talk about that. Otherwise, it continues to happen for generations. And my kids, like I said before, end up having these same conversations 25 years from now when they shouldn't be having them at all. Hope that answers the question.
Okay. So next up, I'll invite Mr. Stanford to make his comment.
First, I would like to congratulate both speakers, both being so articulate and focused. But I would, in particular, like to congratulate Mala's parents for that upbringing. And I'd also like to tell her that because I'm some 3 years older than her father, I've seen a thing or two, both in my native Jamaica and in Canada, to which I migrated in 1959. So there are a general feel that I have for the country as I've seen it changed, but very specific to the public service. I noticed you're talking mostly about the Department of Justice, if not exclusively, which I suppose that's your point of focus. But looking at the wider public service and just the federal one, there's a lot of work that has preceded what you are currently doing or trying to do. Mr. Nandan referred to sort of almost a post former activity of his, but in particular, Professor John Samuel, Dr. John Samuel, and others. But before all this, there has been, a number of situations arising, notably in Vancouver and Toronto, that led to, first in the case of Ontario, the Pittman Report and so on. But moving forward, there have been, even for the Department of Justice, there have been a pretty a much earlier report. I know something about what is contained in the report, the parliamentary report, Equality Now. And I won't go into the extent of my involvement in that. But I was also involved in that, in some two studies, previous studies of the Department of Justice, exclusively on those. So I would suggest that in putting aside the seismic impact, and this is worldwide, of the Floyd event and the significance of that. And it's got a ripple effect throughout the world, we understand that. But that is a broader and bigger question and a thing of wider implications that, and it will go forward for another 10, 15, 20 years. But if you're coming back to the kind of blueprint for action that I hear the second speaker talk about, it's nice to be that sharp and focused, but there are a lot of things said in that I could challenge and others would challenge. So I think we ought to be very careful when we are dealing with things as complex as we have admitted them to be too sort of bipolar, so to speak, in our approach. I don't think a lot of these things are black or white. Coming from a multiracial, multicultural society, and I used to boast about that, and coming from a country where blacks were the majority, although we had quite a range, and most of us from that country, from Jamaica, are actually multiracial, and that's another thing to go into. If you notice in general, that if you ask somebody from Jamaica, and it could be anything, they could be what we call half Chinese, half Indian, all kinds of mixtures, as I think Pamela Harris's people will tell you. They come from a position of confidence to which Richard alluded about the music and so on, but there's more to that. So Jamaica was the model for a lot of some of the activities that took place in the United States. Not only do we have people like Marcus Garvey that had the United States and international impact, but we had literally people who served as models, especially second generation ones, the parents of Colonel Powell, General Powell. So it depends on where you're coming from. And I was noticing that in Kamala's, in the Learned Council's, how should I put it, or testimonial, or testimony, that there is that complexity in this, but in all the circumstances, she seemed to have been somewhat marginal. And so it's much different if you come from a place where you are the government, you run the civil service, and you are part of the great cultural mix that gives you the fantastic music and other things. And then of course that you have the great sportsmen. So you're record breaking, not only on the track, but in literature and so on. So, I mean, it's when I hear, and may I respond very quickly because there's so much more to say by everybody. When you're dealing with the Aboriginals, I'm hearing one dimension, but do not forget their association with the Crown, because you say that our Royal Common Society is involved in this. People from the society should know about that relationship, which is very direct. It's not just the Crown of Canada, but the Crown itself. And their constitutional standing and the kind of ownership that they have for land, that they're mining, the great economic potential that they have. I'm
sure, Mr. Stanford, that we're going to have another session on that.
Yes, but that's a different discussion.
Yes.
From the issue of your rank order in the Department of Justice, or the opportunities for promotion.
Sure.
And I'm just saying that
Fine. In the interest of time. In the interest of time. Yeah. Mr. Stanford, you've made some very important observations, and definitely we should continue that discussion. We invite you to perhaps join the guest speakers, and we can have an offline discussion to further, your thoughts and on a very complex matter. So I think Colin has been waiting for quite a while with his hand up. And we are running, we're coming to the close of our event, but I'd like to call on Colin.
Thank you very much. Just a bit of a preamble and then my question. I'm a foreign medical physician, came to Canada and integrated well into the system. The observations by the two speakers was very interesting, though I never heard anything concrete about their own personal discriminatory exposure from an employment point of view. Nevertheless, I want to frame it in as much as it was interesting hearing about Mala's parents eloping. It was interesting about Carl's, a second speaker, and his interracial marriage. And the reason for that, the only reason I highlight it, is because even within the South Asian culture, we have this class divide and interaction. You can't marry this way, you can't marry that, religious. So these racial tones.
Yep, we just froze.
Oh dear. Okay, well, while we're waiting for him to come back, the next thing was a question in the chat from Andrea Burke. Mala, as a racialized woman navigating a career in the public service, how do you address intersectional issues of race and gender in circumstances when you may be the only woman or a racialized person at the table?
Thank you for that question. It's an interesting one. I find I'm not ever the only woman at the table. I think that is one area where in the public service at the executive level, we have made quite a bit of progress in recent years. And so I find I'm often surrounded by women. That said, they're often white women. And I think it is challenging to find a way to talk. We don't easily talk about what it means to experience racism and sexism at the same time. And I think that's what intersectionality tries to do, is really uncover what those, when you place them together, it produces something, a different experience. And I will admit that when I'm having conversations about gender equality today, I am often talking about the inequality that white women face. I'm not often having conversations about the gender inequality that women of color face, or that women with disabilities face, or that lesbian women face. And I think that's just because of the sort of dominant identities or sort of discourses around what it is, what gender is, and what race is. And so I think the thing that we need to be trying to do is really try and understand and pull out those different lived experiences wherever we can. But it is a different part of the discussion that I think has to happen.
Thank you very much, Mala, for your response to that question. I think we'll take one last question.
So that will be Chandra. Yeah.
Yes. Chandra, you'll have to unmute to ask your question. Okay, perhaps, I think, okay, so perhaps we'll return to Chandra offline, Stephen, because he has his hand up, but we can't seem to reach him. I think this brings to a close our question and answer period, and we thank the audience for their very insightful questions, and for Mr. Diar for summing up all the responses so skillfully. And I would like to thank Stephen for managing the chat portion as well. I'd like to invite Dr. Nipa Banerjee, who is also another distinguished member of the India-Canada Friendship Circle board. And Dr. Banerjee is a senior fellow and adjunct professor in the School of International Development and Global Studies at University of Ottawa. She's also a principal researcher with the Center for International Policy Studies, also in Ottawa. Dr. Banerjee, if you wouldn't mind, we're very short on time, but within a few minutes, if you're able to provide a summary of some of the key highlights that you heard in the presentations and the comments coming from the audience, that would be greatly appreciated. Dr. Banerjee? Stephen, do you see Dr. Banerjee's?
Hi,
Roohi.
There she
Thank
is.
Yes,
There
I'm
she
here.
is. Thank you.
Well, you know, I don't know if I need to do a summary because Prakash has done a pretty good job on doing that. And this evening has been, really, it overwhelmed me. And it's really has been a deeply absorbing evening listening to Mala and Richard. I have been a civil servant. I've been with Ottawa University since 2007, but I was with the public service and all my career, all the years I was with CEDA. Well, my experiences are very much like that of Mala. I came to Canada to study all by myself as a single woman. I'll give you a little bit of a reference to why I came to Canada and how I came to Canada. I was born in India, by the way, and I finished my school there. Now, when I was little, my mother used to take me to visit her friends rather than leaving me at home by myself. I know she would take me there. And it so happened that my parents, my brother, I had only one brother, you know, they're kind of what Indians call fair complexioned, not like white people, but they are fair for Indian standards. And I am darker. And I heard every time I went, in fact, I was, I think, 5, 6 years old, I heard, you know, my mother's friends would tell my mother that, you know, you really have to, we don't know what you are going to do with her because you won't be able to get her married. She is dark. You know, we wish that your son was dark and she was fair, but that's not the case. What will you do? You know, by the time I finished my high school, I decided that I didn't want any of those things coming to me. I didn't want to get married and I didn't want arranged marriage so that, you know, people will come to see me and will talk about my skin, etc. So I decided I must go abroad, make my own life. And I started applying. Strangely enough, I got a scholarship from McMaster University and I came to Canada. That is the way I came. And I must say, I found that there was no discrimination. You know, nobody told me that you are dark and therefore you won't be married. Probably that didn't come to their mind. But, you know, I found the university absolutely the atmosphere. I loved it. And one thing, and this is funny, I found that that Indian men, there weren't any women, actually Indian women weren't there. And so all the Indian men were very interested in me. And so I thought that it was a good thing that I came. And honestly speaking, I gained a lot of confidence. And not only in going out with boys, but a lot of confidence in everything else in my life. You know, I was listening to Mala and I was thinking probably her experience, I don't know what her experience would be in that, but anyway, that was something that was excellent. And we didn't talk today that much about, except Richard referred to it, that how the Indian society is very racist, I find. You know, this business about distinguishing between who are black and who are darker and who are fairer, as well as, you know, I hear from Indian people the way they talk about the black people because they're a shade fairer than the black people, the way they talk about the black people. So, you know, someday I think we can talk about that. And Richard just started, but he didn't talk about it. So, when we criticize the white people, I think we should look at ourselves and, see where the problem lies. And when Richard talks about bringing about change, and right here in Canada, within Ottawa, the Indian community itself. Sorry, and I might bother some people that I'm saying this. However, an extremely absorbing evening. I just loved Mala's presentation because this came from her heart. Richard's also did, but maybe because I'm a woman and she's a woman, it appealed to me. So thank you, Richard, and thanks, Mala, for coming. Personally, I enjoyed it, and I'm sure our audience did. Maybe someday we should have a session on racialized women, and then also a session on how India and some of the South Asian countries mainly, look upon how they handle race. It is an important issue. Thank you, and thanks both of you.
Thank you, Dr. Banerjee, for sharing your very interesting perspectives and your personal journey to Canada. And you have also skillfully captured some important points that were raised by our speakers. And I just wanted to maybe quickly add something, if I may, because I felt Graham Barber, I don't know if he's still there, I hope he is. I still feel that he made a very important point in that, if we put ourselves in his shoes and look at it from the issues from his perspective as a physician, he has to do away with the social construct of race, color, ethnicity, religion in order to treat the patient. And, we talked about equal access to vaccines, for example, being an issue on a global scale. And I'm sure, there's an issue within many countries in terms of the equal access to healthcare and other systems, whether it's education. The issue is so complex. And I did like the way, in the end, Graham Barber, Dr. Barber did, look at each and every one of us as a human being. So that in itself puts me in great comfort in the hands of a physician like that. And I think we have to be grateful to our healthcare workers who have done a great job during this pandemic in trying to create a safe and healthy environment for all of us during these very difficult times during this pandemic. So I just wanted to add that. And Lloyd Stanford had an interesting point, which goes back to, well, it depends on where we come from, because I have always noticed that my parents, for example, coming from India originally, they, those who have already formed their identity and are coming from a place of confidence, that's something that we actually, in the next generation, have to develop and build from the ground up, because we didn't have what the previous generation had, and in having that confidence and identity already built before they came to Canada. So without any further comment from the audience or our speakers, I think we have come to a successful close. And I'm very grateful. We are all grateful. On behalf of the board, we thank everyone for joining us and being open and frank with your personal experiences and comments and criticisms, and also sharing in favor whatever comments they were able to relate to. This is what the ICFC is all about. having an open forum where we can all have a harmonious dialogue in a peaceful environment and learn from each other and hopefully build new friendships so that we can continue this dialogue outside outside of the ICFC. And finally, I just wanted to bring to your attention that on June 21st, Canadians will be celebrating National Indigenous Peoples Day. So to mark this occasion, the ICFC will be hosting a lecture on June 23rd by Dr. Stephen Inglis. Dr. Inglis was formerly a researcher, curator, and Director General of Research and Collections at the Canadian Museum of Civilization. So he will give the next ICFC Diversity and Inclusion Lecture focused on his latest work involving Indigenous art and history. In the fall, we will look at popular sports in Canada and India, namely hockey and cricket, as cultural unifiers. And our guest speaker will be our very own Dr. Stephen Desjardins, the Vice President of ICFC. And once again, Stephen, I just want to recognize your contribution to keeping us all together through this Zoom event and sending out the invitations and keeping us on track, technically speaking. Thank you. Thank you for everything.
And
so,
the great music.
Yeah.
And the great music.
Yeah. Well, I have to thank YouTube for that. I found music on YouTube, so we have to credit YouTube. And the Indian artists, of course, and Bollywood. Anyhow, so thank you, everybody. We encourage you all to sign up with the ICFC through our website to get on our mailing list. And we look forward to seeing you at our next event on June 23rd. So once again, to all our speakers and our wonderful moderator. And yes?
Can you just give me 2 seconds?
Of course.
You know, the discussion by everyone tonight, in particular by Mala and Richard and Graham as well, reminded me of a beautiful African term called Ubuntu. Ubuntu is humanity. I am because we are. And it reminded me so much about what this discussion has been. And to illustrate what it really means is illustrated by a really nice example. A European anthropologist went to an African village. There were about 24 kids. I don't know, probably about 7, 8 years old. About 24 of them. And in a distance, he placed a beautiful basket with really nice, rich, sweet fruit. And he said to the kids, the one who goes and reaches the fruit first will get all of the fruit. So go for it. And to his amazement, all these kids held hands and they ran together and they reached the basket together. And the anthropologist asked his kids, why didn't you run and try and win so you could have everything for yourself? And the kid said, how can I be happy when my friends will be sad? So it's a great illustration of real humanity that I think if we all are happy, I mean, can just one person or one race be happy with others are being unhappy and sad and having to be fight for their rights? So I thought I'd just share that lovely African story.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing us the story of Ubuntu. That is a very touching and a perfect conclusion to tonight's event. So thank you for that, Prakash. And once again, Nipa, thank you. And we look forward to seeing all of you soon. And Mala and Richard, if any of our members would like to speak to you separately offline, we hope you'll be open to receiving more questions down the road. So once again, if anyone wants to remain online to socialize, you're welcome. Otherwise, we'll see you soon. Stay safe and have a good night. Thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Stephen, you can open up the mics.
Anybody else have any around, like Freud?